Hey, this is C. Hope Clark again. This session will be about editing. Write it, read it, rewrite it, and repeat. So let's say you have written your book, nonfiction or fiction, doesn't matter which, but you now have a manuscript in your hands. You have reached the end, and that is a tremendous release. I've been there multiple times. It feels so satisfying to get the end of that first draft. What do you do at that point, though? Please, by no means do you publish a first draft. There isn't an author alive that can publish a first draft. So what I'm going to want you to do is to put it aside for a week minimum. Just want you to put it aside and not look at it. Because what you're doing is letting all that dust you've stirred up writing all that story settle. So that when you do pick it back up, it's cooled down a little bit and you tend to read it more like a reader than you do as the author. And it is in that moment that you're going to see so many problems. At the same time, you might suggest somebody else read it, because you're not going to catch everything. It is impossible to self-edit. You can do it only so far, but you're not going to catch everything, because too much of that is imprinted on your mind and your eyes will just gloss over a lot of things because it's recorded. So have someone else read it as well and give you notes as to what they find. Of course, if you can meet with them, all the better. Read your copy swiftly. The first time you pick it back up, read it swiftly because you want to read it like a reader. You don't want to catch yourself bogging down, wondering if you did this right or that right. Don't put that author hat on. Keep your reader hat on to see if you really have a legit story going on here. You can note what works well. You can look at it and go, oh, that feels good. I relate to the character there. Or you can get to a chapter and go, I'm bogging down. You can make a quick note, but don't stop and try to fix it right there. Don't be afraid of major changes in the book. And you will eventually write a book, if not your first one, your second one, your third one. I'm still making major changes in books. So what I want you to do is not be afraid that you need to shift things around. I have deleted entire characters before. I had in one book where my publisher sent it back to me and said, love the story, but you have 2 climaxes in it, which often happens in a mystery, when the other shoe falls. And she says, I want you to switch those climaxes. I want the other one to come first. Floored me because I said, one caused the other. I don't know how to flip them. And she says, I couldn't figure it out either, but I'm sure you can handle it. And she gave me 4 days to do it. So it can be done. You can make major changes, and I promise you, 99% of the time, it will be a much stronger book if you do bite the bullet and make those major changes. Find someone to bounce ideas off of. If you're seeing the need for a major change, or to do without a character, or maybe there's a hole here where you think another character is needed. I've had to insert an entire character before. If you feel like there's something there but you're not sure, contact that person that read the book, that you asked them to edit the book for you, and say, I'm thinking of changing this, what do you think? Get another opinion. There's nothing wrong with that. I promise you nobody is going to steal your book. Okay, that's a big concern with new writers. Everybody is so bent on writing their own book, they're not going to dream of stealing yours. So don't worry about it. Then you've done all of this that I've talked about. Stop and outline your book. Now you would think at this point that's totally unnecessary, but no, I want you to outline it so that it can carry you through that book and you see how the story is flowing, whether or not the climax builds, whether or not the tension remains there. If you find some scenes where you realize nothing actually happened, you'll put a question mark by that one. Outlining it makes you step back and look at it from a little bit bigger picture. So do that. So then I want you to save all those changes and put them in best you can. This is your second draft, so that does not mean this is your final version. Then I want you to read it out loud, the entire book. A lot of writers don't like to do that. It takes hours. It takes hours and hours. But before I turn in a manuscript to a publisher, I read it aloud. My husband luckily is patient enough to listen to it. And I read it aloud and I find so many mistakes that I never would have just reading it on a screen or reading it on paper. Trust me, reading it on a screen, reading it silently on paper, reading it aloud on paper, 3 different types of edits. You will find mistakes in all 3 that you wouldn't find with the other 2. If you did one, you wouldn't find it in the other 2. It's just the way your brain works. You're trying to look at the story from another angle and make your brain function in a different way to catch things. Trust me, 3 different ways. So, let's talk about the 3 different types of editing. If you send a manuscript into a publisher, they're going to put it through 3 different types of editing. So when you are indie publishing or self-publishing a book, you should also think about it in these same terms. When I turn in a manuscript to my editor, the first thing they do is do a developmental edit. Developmental means, does this story even make sense? Is this story marketable? Does it have a beginning, middle, and end? Does this character have a good arc? It's big picture things, it's general. But for a publisher, it's mainly, can we sell this? So that's the big picture. That's normally when somebody tells me to switch the climaxes or take a character out or put another one in. Then, once you decide, okay, the bones for this story are good, then you go to a line edit. And that's your copy editor. They will go through that story bit by bit, and they make sure that it flows. They're looking at sentence structure. They're looking at paragraph structure. They're making sure that it's not wordy, that it is intriguing, the types of words you used. They also will check some things like, in a mystery, you would check gun calibers. You would check if they were wearing a vest in one chapter and then they're not wearing it in the next. You're looking for little flaws that popped up. And you would wonder how those could even exist. But they do, because when you write, you may decide this person needs to drive an old Audi instead of a new Lexus. But you changed it in 5 places, but not the 6th. So you will do things like that. You will change the names of characters, because suddenly you realize you have 3 characters whose names begin with C. So 2 of them have got to be changed. So you will do that and then miss one. I think one of the biggest headaches I had with character names was the name Jessie in my first book. And my copy editor kept trying to change it to Jessie when I had it Jesse. And you go back and forth in this read, you need a fine eye of someone reading over it so that you catch those little teeny things. They will also go into grammar, repetition of words, sometimes punctuation. But your line editor could be different from your copy editor. Most of the time they're one and the same. But it's a deep, hard-packed edit that's covering all the flaws that are in your story. Then, once that's done, it goes to a proofreader. Proofreader is making sure that spelling's right, typos, missing words, just the obvious, the blatant obvious errors. So that gives you an idea of the layers of editing that is involved. So when new authors think, I've done a first draft and then I've done a hard second edit, I'm ready to go, which is a good many of your self-published authors, it's a far cry from it. Because it needs a developmental edit. In my case, somebody else does the developmental edit, sends it to me with suggestions. I do rewrites and edits. Then it goes back and goes to that line editor / copy editor. They do their work, send it back to me and go, what do you think? And do you see anything else? Goes back, proofreader does it. They send it back to me and says, what do you think? Read through it again. So after I send a manuscript to a publisher, I go over it a minimum of 3 times in between the other edits. So that is traditional publishing. Traditional is going to go through a lot of edits, and if you're going to indie, you need to do the exact same thing on your own. So just keep that in mind. The big stuff, the big picture stuff to look for in a manuscript, what is the theme? Did you carry the theme out all the way through the book, or did you lose it somewhere around chapter 14? Are there secondary plots, subplots, which often turns into personal problems or little minor mysteries that spin off the big mystery? You're going to have some subplots. Did you solve those and bring them around as much as you did the big one? Sometimes they can get lost in all the busyness. Does your story start at the right place? Most new authors do not start a book at the right place. They'll start thinking they have to describe the character and talk about background, and then you get 4, 5, 6 pages into it, even a chapter into it, and then the action starts. So you might realize once you sit back and read it, or somebody else reads it for you, that first chapter is yawn. It's just not doing anything. And you realize, as happens with new authors, your story started in chapter 2. So keep that in mind. That's a big picture thing. Is the opening hook compelling? Does it draw you in? Is there too much backstory? Is there too much character description? Does the dialogue propel the plot? Do you catch yourself skimming dialogue because you know it's not going to say anything? And are the moods, is the atmosphere, are the aha moments intriguing? Do you thoroughly enjoy reading them once you finally get to read them as a reader? Or did they not come off as well as you thought they would? So you've got to be very, very honest with yourself. Now let's look for the little stuff to look for in your edits. Of course, one thing is spelling. Second is going to be grammar. Consistency in names, places, eye color, dress, places, automobiles. It just goes on and on and on. And believe me, readers will find the mistakes. They definitely will. Look for fragmented sentences, because your brain may be working one way, but it only goes down on the page as a piece of a sentence, and you've left out a word or two that corrupted the flow of the sentence. Duplicated words. You will find, as every writer does, you have your favorite words, and you don't want to have those repeated. So as I am doing my initial edit on my manuscript, I keep a piece of paper, and especially if you read it aloud, your tongue will trip up on those repetition words. And I may have away 6 times on a page, and I need to find some other word to replace that or reword the sentence. You will do that so many times. But keep a list, and usually it winds up being about 20 words that I have repeated over and over and over in a particular book, and no 2 books are alike. I find different words for each one. So you just can't bank on your last list to check on your new book. You've got to catch them all. So do that, and then you just do a simple Control F on your computer to find those words, and it'll highlight your entire manuscript, and it looks like it goes on forever. But all those little yellow highlighted words, you want to go through and see, okay, that one's got to stay. I can't change that one, which means you want to change the next 3. So that'll challenge you. That'll really make your word pop when you realize you've got to totally redefine a sentence because it's got a repetition word in it. Watch for your point of view shifts. Don't let a chapter be one character talking and then it kind of shift into the head of another. Very easy to do when you're trying to find out what that character knows. It still has to be from the right point of view. Watch awkward word choice. Watch lazy words. There's lots of lazy words. Little, please avoid doing that. Very. There's so many ways to say those without using them. Get and got sounds very blue collar. And when you use those, it stunts the meaning of a sentence. Try and avoid those. She thought, and then you write what she thought. just put down what she thought. Don't say she thought, she started to, she began to. Don't do that. Just write it without it. Because what you're doing is diluting the momentum when you put those types of words in. Push and pull, that's a common one we tend to use. Had. That's a bad one of mine. Had is repetitious. Watch ambiguous words. That, thing, it. Try to avoid those. If you read those, you may know what it means, but when the reader reads it, might not. So try to avoid using ambiguous words that could have multiple meanings. Trouble words. Watch your trouble words. Affect, effect, there, to. You know, those kinds of words. And we may know the rules. I loved grammar in school. I have a pretty firm grasp of it, which makes my writing a little easier. But I am slayed every single time when I go through edits and realize I used a word I knew better. And it's because I'm so into the story and so writing it that I'm just writing and it happened to be the one that flipped out. So you will do it. I promise you will do it. Farther, further, lay, lie, that's my nemesis. I have to look it up every time. That, who, you, your, who, whom, less, fewer. There's a lot of those like that. So just be careful with those. And if somebody corrects you on them, it's fine. You need to be corrected. Just learn from it. ING words. You will fall into a habit. Every new author does. Seasoned authors can do it, where you wind up using ING verbs. Words, not just verbs. And it may read fine when you're reading it silently on your screen, but you pull that paper up and read it aloud and you hear yourself going ing, 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 and it will pop off. So watch those. Watch your verb tenses shifting. Are you present? Are you past? Are you past perfect? You know, what verb tense are you writing in? And you can easily slip into, in a complicated sentence, you can slip into another one. Adverbs. Try to avoid them. There's a reason there are adverbs, so I can't say don't use them, but use them minimally, because adverbs are a definitely tell versus show type of writing. When you use an ly word, a word that ends with ly, you are trying to let that word carry the action in the sentence, where if you take that word out, you can show so much more. And I'm going to try and show you that in some examples. Watch excessive adjectives. Don't get flowery in your writing. And watch passive voice. Passive voice is a killer to a lot of people because they don't understand it. And passive voice, I will go into a little bit to give you a taste. If you can get rid of passive voice, except like adverbs, sparingly, then you will take your writing to such a better level. There's some basic things. If you learn passive voice and you learn showing versus telling, you can take your writing to a whole new level just with those two tricks. Avoid cliches. Cliches are fun, they're cool, and in the South we tend to use them a lot. We can get quite creative with our cliches and i.e. metaphors. We like to say things are this as this, you know, sweet as sugar. You know, you can go on and on with those because we tend to love them. But make sure you're not using ones that are commonplace, because you don't want your writing to sound commonplace. The only exception is if you have a character that loves to use cliches. That's it. Otherwise, don't use them. If you're going to use any type of metaphor, make sure they're original. So Carolina Slade is in my first series, and she has a little streak of humor to her, and she loves metaphors, but she makes up her own. And what I find I do when I'm writing her is I tend to fall back on a regular cliche, and then I go, can't do that. Let's make this fun. Let's make it something really quirky and creative. It's become a character trait. So I thoroughly enjoy writing her. Strings of prepositional phrases. That also will have you telling instead of showing. And you will find a sentence, especially a long sentence, and find 4 and 5 prepositional phrases in it. So be careful with that. too much physiology. Hands, fingers, arms, eyes, ears, mouth, nose, just goes on, elbows, arms, feet. You will find in trying to show versus tell, or trying to use beats in your dialogue, that you tend to use body parts. She waved her hands, she winked her eyes, she elbowed somebody. You find yourself on a page, you might have 10 body parts there, and it starts losing its impact. So be careful as to what you're doing there, and try to find other ways to show movement other than just what somebody did with their face and hands. Let's cover passive voice a little bit. I said I'd come back to it. It is not a grammatical error. It's just a type of grammar that can weaken your writing if you use it too much. It can inhibit clarity, and it definitely slows down action. It's when the object of the action is turned into the subject. Okay, I hate those kind of definitions. I hated that. Grammar, don't tell me the technicalities, show me the examples. So that's, the road was crossed by the chicken. That's passive. The road was crossed by the chicken. So, the chicken crossed the road is active. That's a very, very simple one. But do you see the difference? The road was crossed by the chicken. You're not seeing it. You don't feel like there's action. But when you say the chicken crossed the road, you're seeing the chicken cross the road. It's very, very, that's a simplistic way to show it. But passive voice can sneak up on you when you're writing in a story and you get more complicated. But trust me, 99% of the time, you change passive to active, and it is a crisper, more visual sentence. Look for a form of to be in your sentences, and that's a little flag about passive voice. So, is, am, are, was, were, being, been, have been, has been, all of those types of words weaken a sentence. So write those down if you need to on a piece of notebook paper or a little sticky next to you when you're doing your editing to see if you can find those. The city had been scorched by the dragon's breath. Why not just say the dragon's breath scorched the city? That's changing from passive to active. I took had been and just changed it to scorched. It's just so much more vivid. The fish was caught by the seagull. The seagull caught the fish. I think you can see that. I'm going to give you some examples in a minute. What is showing versus telling? Because what I'm going to do is combine passive and then showing and telling. Since I said those are the key things to correct in your editing to make your writing raise a notch. You want to show 90% of the time. There are a few places where telling is absolutely necessary. If you showed an entire scene and these characters reacted and they conversed, they reacted to things they didn't expect, and you've got all this in a scene, then you take one of those characters, move to another scene downstream, and they run into somebody else who wasn't there. You do not want to react the entire scene showing that scene again. You will take a little snippet and tell it to that other character so that you don't bore the reader. That's where telling is necessary. But otherwise, when something is initially happening, you want to show it. You want to show it. It's where characters actually do things that excites the reader's interest. You're not telling the reader what the character did. You're showing the character doing it. The story is actually more visual when you get rid of the passive, when you show versus tell and get rid of the passive voice. The reader feels he is learning moments firsthand when you are showing versus telling, rather than a narrator telling the reader what happened. Can the reader sense the character's feelings? Are you naming emotions instead of conveying them? If you say somebody was afraid, you are telling versus showing. Instead, show what made them fearful. Show what scared them. So that gives you a little idea. So let's give you some examples. He was tired and took a walk. Or he walked the 4 blocks as if it were his last mile. I combined changing passive to active and showed it. That You told a story. You can see him dragging his feet in the second one. When you say he was tired and took a walk, that doesn't stick with you and it doesn't matter to you. He was tired, so. He took a walk, so. If you find yourself reading a sentence and pull the so what test on it, you might be able to correct a lot of these things. Another one, Polly loved to dive in her swimming pool. Or, Polly hurtled from the rattling board and surfaced, grinning through the kelp of her own hair. You can see that. You can almost smell that. You can almost smell the chlorine in that one. That's what you're trying to do. When a writer tells me that they have too short of a book or too short of a story, they've written 35,000 or 40,000 words and they're trying to get to 55, 60, 70, first thing I do is say, watch your passive voice and go in and change your telling to showing. Because as you just learned from there, the showing sentences are usually longer because they're more dynamic, they have more depth to them, so they're going to be a little bit longer. So if you want to make your story longer, show. Get rid of the passive voice. I promise it will make it a better story as well as give you a few more words. He was nervous, or he tapped his fingers on the desk blotter. When you have to name emotions, you are telling. You want to show it without naming the emotion. Helen was a wonderful woman, always concerned about her 2 children. Okay? Or Helen parked her car when she drove her children in the morning, and with one hand on each, accompanied them to the door of the school. You've showed she's concerned about them without saying she's concerned about them. His hair was dark and limp, dark hair draped thin and limp on his shoulders. You can see that better. That's out of one of my books. Jeb was afraid and searched for his mother, or Jeb beat his way through the throng and threw himself in his mother's arms. So that kind of gives you an idea. Ways to avoid telling. So you want to learn how to show versus tell. When I'm giving this to a live group, I get so many puzzled looks on people's faces because they haven't quite grasped it. So let's talk about the ways to avoid telling. Use more dialogue. That's the first and foremost. When you are using dialogue, you are actually trying to put the person there, and you're using words. You tend to use more action words when you're speaking versus when you're just narrating. So use more dialogue. Use 5 senses. When you have to describe something that smells and not say the word smell, you can do it. You start showing. It's the same with all the other senses. Use less adjectives. Use more verbs. Avoid the adverbs, the ly verbs. We've already talked about that. Use more precise nouns. Okay, you can say there was a cat in the alley. You can say there was a feline in the alley. You can say there was a tomcat in the alley. So there's a big difference between cat and tomcat. A tomcat carries connotations. A cat's a cat. A soldier versus a sergeant versus a Marine. Big, big difference. Okay. So when you've got your nouns in there, think if you can use a more profound noun. That can help you show versus tell. Use your metaphors, but avoid your cliches. Avoid words like, it seemed like this, it felt like that. He noticed that, he could see that. Avoid those types of things. Just put it on the paper. Don't say he felt that. Just show his reaction to it. He noticed Nancy coming versus Nancy lumbered toward him. Okay? I mean, you got a difference. He noticed Nancy coming toward him versus Nancy lumbered toward him. So don't say he noticed, he realized, he saw. He realized he left the door open versus he spun around at the cold wind on his back, crap, the back door. He never said it was open, yet you knew it was open. So it takes a little time. Avoid the in words, in, before a noun. He did something in fear, in time, in love. Cut that out and try to write it without it, and you'll start showing. Be careful of when and as. When he did so-and-so, then, as he did so-and-so, and then you finish the sentence. Try to write without as and when. That you're trying, it's like you're trying to introduce what the guy should be doing instead of just showing doing it. That one's a little more complex, but when you're reading, notice in a good book how few of those you see. In a bad book, you'll see a lot of these things. Be specific every time you can instead of vague. But, that does not give you permission to overwrite. Do not try to be Shakespeare. Do not try to use what we call purple prose. Purple prose is where it gets so floral, it's painful to read. So I've only known a handful of people that did that. I had a suspense author, great suspense author in one of my critique groups. He loved purple prose. And we were forever saying, take it down, Barry, take it down, Barry. We love the action, but we don't need to get all elaborate about it. So he was fun. He was a lot of fun. Now let's talk about something we call kill your darlings. It used to be called kill your babies, but that has such negative connotations. Kill your darlings means that you have written, could be purple prose, it could be words that you think are remarkable, the best thing you've ever written, you love it. Those are the ones you want to take the hardest look at. The reason being is you may be so in love with it that you're not editing it. Be careful. It could be, you may think it's some of your best writing, and it could totally stall the story because you're so in love with the words that you're not seeing the big picture. It will happen once, twice, hopefully not more than that in your lifetime, where you will have this remarkable piece of writing, take it to critique group, and they go, oh, this doesn't help the story at all, when you thought it was the best piece in the whole thing. Be willing to pull it out. It will be painful. Rewrite it without it and see what it does. Chances are some of your best writing slows the pace of the story because you're too caught up in the writing. Third, it may not aid the tension of the story. So if you see a piece that you're too much in love with, try to step back from it and give it the test of whether or not it slows the story down. If you can cut it out and it not be missed, guess what? It shouldn't have been there. You fell in love with it and you got blind to it. Okay, what should your word count be? Depends on what you're writing. A lot of people think, well, as long as I have 50,000 words. That may be fine if you're writing romance or a cozy mystery. It may be fine for a young adult. It is not going to be good for sci-fi and fantasy and an adult mystery. So you've got to know what the word count tends to be in your genre. A lot of people will ask me, what should be the word count in my chapter? That varies. Trends say, here lately, people prefer shorter chapters. I don't know if you've read Stephen King, but he will have a long chapter and then he'll have something that might be this long. And he does it for impact. There is no rhyme or reason to how you do your chapters. But just know, if you're going to write a 5,000 word chapter, which is a long chapter, in say an 80,000 word book, readers tire a little bit of it. And they're looking for a place to park it to close the book until the next time. So just keep that in mind. When you tend to go long, stop and see if you don't have 2 chapters there. But there's, in an adult book, I would say rule of thumb, if I had to say, would be 2,000 to 3,000 words. But again, know your genre. Also know the preference of the publisher you're publishing for. They may want shorter chapters. They may only want so many chapters in a book. They may think a best book is 30 chapters. And that depends on, the wording depends on whether or not you're writing a 50,000 or 100,000 word book. You should write with a goal. And just write your story first and foremost. You may write it in 30 chapters and go back and look at it again when you've done all of this editing and the outline I told you to do, and realize that it's 28 chapters or 35 chapters. You can restructure all your chapters and all that editing. So, why read aloud? Let's just tap on that a little bit. It's because your eyes will deceive you. Your eyes will play tricks on you. Your eyes connected to the brain, they work in tandem. If you have imprinted that story on paper the first time, that's going to be the keenest it's going to imprint on your brain. So your eyes know to look for that way. And once you start editing, you've got a little bit of a resistance there. So that's the reason you read aloud. Your eyes, your brain can't deceive both your eyes and your tongue. So when you're reading and you find yourself tripping up over sentences, stop and dissect them. Look at them very hard. Because if it's not just you worn out from reading for hours and your tongue trips on that sentence, there's a reason. There is a reason. Because your brain's reading it one way and your mouth is reading it another. If you catch yourself running out of breath on long sentences, your sentences are too long. When you realize that dialogue isn't clear who is speaking, the best way to know that is to read that dialogue aloud, because you're talking it like it's an active conversation. And if you're reading it aloud as if the players are sitting right there in front of you and you lose track of who's speaking, you know you have a problem. Awkward phrasing will stand out because you'll read it and go, wait a minute, what does that mean? Read it again. You need to change it. Passive versus active voice pops off the page at that point. Once you learn what passive voice is, you catch it. You catch it a lot quicker. If you have trouble speaking for long periods of time, have somebody try to read it to you if you got some wonderful angel that's willing to do that with you. Or there are some online speech tools that you can use where you can cut and paste, say, a chapter in, and it will read it to you. And that does just as good a job, I think. Text-to-speech.org is one. That's TEXT2, speech.org. And there's something called acapella-box.com that also has one. And I'm sure if you Googled online, you would find several. And some of them sound like robot voices, and some of them sound like the girl from Australia, like your GPS. But you will find them, and you pick the voice you want, and then you sit there and follow it with your finger, on paper as they read it to you. You will correct a world of ills. What is a beta reader? You may have heard of what a beta reader is. And a lot of authors switch from critique groups after a while to just purely beta readers. At this stage in my career, I only have beta readers, and I have 4 of them. They are my go-to people. So when I am at the end of a book, I shoot them my manuscript and they read it for me. So they are my reading friends that want to go over my book and help me fix it. A critique group will take your book piece by piece as you show up to your group or you join online, and they will go over 1,000 words, 2,000 words, 3,000 words, whatever their limit happens to be. And you do it a piece at a time. A beta reader is willing to go full bore the whole book. And they are there to give you serious feedback. There's none of this tap dancing as to feelings and all of that. A beta reader knows her job is to hammer a book. And your job as the author is to take it and learn from it. There are no feelings involved. It's also somebody who reads your genre. You want them to understand why you're writing like you do. A romance reader is not going to read a mystery the same. So just know, someone who is not afraid to be honest with you. They need to be honest with you. Somebody who is reliable so that you give it to them, they will give it back within a reasonable period of time. Because you're wanting to get this book published, you want to get it edited. So if somebody gets it and sits on it for 6 months, of course, that's not a good beta reader. Normally, a beta reader will give something back to you in a month. Who is not a beta reader? I want to make this very clear. Your best friend. That's not your beta reader. Not unless your best friend is an author or a writer or reads a genre and is an expert in it. So unless you've got that exception as a best friend, avoid your best friend. Not your spouse, not your significant others. They're going to be tainted. Not family, unless they're professionals. Not people who tend to be nice. You will have the people that want to make you feel better. They want to go, this is great, I'm so proud of you. You don't want any of that. You don't want any of that. And you also don't want people that are so close to you that when they read something they don't understand, they go, oh, I understand what she means, because they know you so well, they know what that meant. So you want somebody that's got a little tad of a distance from you. So, what about critique groups? I mentioned those briefly. You can do those in person, you can do them online. I have done both. I prefer online. They're quicker. They're more in-depth critiques. When you get in person, you do tend to talk, and you tend to talk why you did things, whereas if you send a chapter to a critique group online, you're not there to banter with them. So they will hit it, and they will hit it harder because they don't have a time limit of a meeting that has to end at 9 o'clock. So I prefer online groups. There are groups in places like absolutewrite.com, that's WRITE, bookcountry.com, critiquecircle.com. And in the handout that I've given the library to put on the site to accompany this video, I have a lot more links. So please download that and take a look at it. There's a lot of groups on there that I think could help you. You can even ask your library or bookstore, is there a critique group going on nearby? And a lot of times they can tell you. A lot of them meet at libraries. And then your state organization. This state's organization is my SCWW.org. And it's a South Carolina Writers Association. Its primary goal is to establish critique groups around the state, and there are some in most of the major cities. There are quite a few. There are 3 in Columbia alone. So just to let you know, my SCWW.org is a South Carolina writers organization that endorses critiques. I've listed resources on that handout about grammar tips, places you can go to look up issues about grammar, commonly confused words, words that are often repeated. There's some fun websites out there that you can go in and learn all sorts of ways to make your writing better, including the free Chicago Manual of Style, so you know how to use your commas right. There's one site on nothing but passive voice to give you a lot of examples. And I've given you some feedback on how to find a freelance editor. I am all for writers hiring a freelance editor. If you want the best beta reader in the world, hire them. Until you find a strong beta reader that you can trust for each and every one of your books, and hopefully you're looking at multiple books, you might want to consider a freelance editor that has no emotional ties to you and only wants to make your work better. So consider a freelance editor, and I've given you several links online for where those can be found, as well as what to look for in hiring one. And you pretty much get what you pay for on those. If somebody says they'll critique your book for $100, be leery. They may not understand. Most critiques will start at $500 and go up for an entire manuscript of 80 to 100,000 words. If you cannot afford that, go back to your critique groups and scout around until you find those that are just solid with good, strong writing members. So that is editing in a nutshell. It's not simple, it is time consuming, but nothing makes a story better than some just hard, fast rules of editing. That's when a story gets its layers, gets its depth, and comes alive. And the more tools and tricks you know about editing, the better writer you're going to be. Thank you.